Building Blocks is a series of 8 sessions about Christian faith.
I think it gives us a strong foundation to work with.
It conveys the idea that aspects of Christian truth build on one another to make a whole that is interesting, practical, truthful, beautiful, intriguing.
I like the Building Blocks because he puts lots of parables into it so that you can understand.
It clears up many questions about Christianity and about what we believe. And
my hope is that the young people who go through the Building Blocks program will come out with a deeper, broader, higher understanding of their faith than they've ever had before. There are many ways to define being a Christian. You can talk about it as being a follower of Jesus, believing in Jesus, having Jesus in your heart, being a member of the Christian community, being born again, being saved. It just goes on and on. I guess it's such an amazing thing that there are many ways of describing it. And it's not that one is right and another is wrong, because I guess it's like a diamond with different faces, that each one is true. Each highlights a different aspect of what it means to be a Christian, which of course is another way of describing it. What I want to do this morning is to give you some new ideas about how you might define being a Christian. So I'm going to ask you again at the end about that question of your definition. At the end of the last session, I said the Old Testament ends with a question mark, with people looking forward and saying, we need somebody to come and help us out, to help us become all that God had in mind for the descendants of Abraham to become. When Jesus comes into the world, Jesus, in an amazing way, fulfills those things that those people looked forward to. We said that the people looked for a king, especially a king who would be like the great King David. Jesus comes, and if you remember the Christmas story, he's descended from the line of David, and he's born in Bethlehem, which is the city that David comes from. And at the time of his death, over the cross, the Romans, rather sarcastically, put the sign, "This is the King of the Jews." There is something kingly about Jesus. The second thing that people looked forward to was somebody who would be a servant, who would show what it means for human beings to be a servant of God and a servant of people, a servant of the world, to use the kingly power and authority to do good, to help and to serve. So when Jesus comes into the world, one of the themes of his whole life is this one: the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. I guess because he came from God, he could have expected to have everybody serve him, to look after him, to feed him, to wash his feet, whatever was necessary. But he says, no, it's I who have come to do the serving. Aha. So someone who is a king and someone who is a servant. But I said, thirdly, there's also this hint that no human being can straighten us out. It's really going to take God coming from the outside into our world to help put things right. When Jesus comes, especially in John's Gospel, he uses a lot of sayings that begin with the words, I am. Some people asked me the other day when I said the word Lord in capital letters in the Old Testament stands for God's personal name, the name Yahweh. People said, well, what does that mean? Most names mean something. Sometimes you'll find a footnote in your Bible that explains it. Nobody really knows what that name means, but it's something like, I am what I am, or I will be what I will be. Say, that doesn't tell me very much. No, it's true. It's very mysterious, but it does tell you that the person with a name like that is full of life and energy and power. So when Jesus comes along and he says kind of casually, oh, by the way, I am the Good Shepherd, there were religious leaders around the wheel for whom the wheel started turning, and they thought, what exactly is he saying? Who is he saying he is? And in that quotation from Ezekiel, God said, the human leaders, the human shepherds are not doing a great job. I think I'm going to have to come and I will be the shepherd of my people. And again, anyone who was clued into the Old Testament, when Jesus stood up and said, by the way, I am the Good Shepherd, would think, wow, is he saying what I think he's saying? Is it possible? Sometimes people will say, well, how is that possible for someone to be a man and God at the same time? Here's a picture that helps me to understand it, and if you like it, you can use it with the kids in the camps. I'm very sorry that the Calvin and Hobbes cartoon series has come to an end, but I still enjoy Calvin and Hobbes. Imagine, if you will, a Calvin and Hobbes cartoon strip where Calvin and Hobbes are arguing about how they came into existence. And one of them, and in my imagination it's Calvin, the little boy, who's saying, I think we came into existence because there is a great cartoonist in the sky who drew us, who thought us up and imagined us and made us the way that we are. And in my imagination, Hobbes the tiger says, no, nothing like that. How can you imagine such a stupid thing? Have you ever seen this cartoonist in the sky? It's just your imagination. And Hobbes says, I think we just came into being by chance. It was just kind of ink blots on a page, and they randomly came into the shape of you and me and Susie Durkins. And that's the way it is. And they can't decide between themselves whether they were created by a cartoonist or they happened by chance and evolution on the page. And then I imagine the cartoonist, Bill Watterson, overhearing this conversation and thinking, I would really like Calvin and Hobbes to know that I exist. I'd like them to know that I made them and I care about them and I have some suggestions for how they might live, especially how they might treat Susie Durkins, little girl down the street. But what can he do? Because he lives in our world. He's a human being in 3 dimensions. They're just flat on the page, often in black and white. How can he communicate across that gap? And then he has an idea. And he says, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to create a new cartoon character called Bill Watterson. And he sketches a character who maybe looks a little bit like him. And he puts into the mouth of the cartoon Bill Watterson the sort of things that he would like to say to Calvin and Hobbes. And he draws this character who is him behaving towards Calvin and Hobbes in a way that shows how he feels towards them. So that Calvin and Hobbes then have the option of responding to the cartoon character who is also the cartoonist. And in a sense, if they like the cartoon character and they respond to the cartoon character and they begin to behave better towards Susie Durkins, they are relating to the cartoonist, because the cartoon character represents exactly what the great cartoonist thinks and says and feels. Well, you see where I'm going with that. That in a sense, we discuss whether God exists. It's as though God says, I wish I could communicate with them. But God lives in many more dimensions than the little 3 that we live in. So how is God to do it? God has many ways to communicate. In the Old Testament, God does it through his actions and through his words. But Christians believe that in the person of Jesus, God was writing himself into the cartoon strip of human life and putting into the mouth of this character the sort of things that God wants to say to us, and having this character behave towards us in a way that shows how God feels towards us. And of course, Christians say that's who Jesus was. Jesus was God written into the human story to be one of us in a way that we could understand. Jesus then fulfills all of those strands from the Old Testament that we looked at in the previous session. If you look at the beginning of Matthew's Gospel, you don't need to turn to it right now. There is a long list of Jesus' family tree, who his father was, his grandfather, great-great-grandfather. Now, as far as we know, Matthew's Gospel was written for Jewish Christians to help them understand Jesus. And so Matthew's Gospel writes Jesus' family tree going back to David. You know why? To remind them that Jesus was a king like David. But then going back to Abraham. Why to Abraham? Because Abraham was the beginning of the nation of Israel. In a sense, that's Jesus' family tree from one point of view, to show Jesus fulfilled everything that was being looked for in the Old Testament. But then if you compare that with the family tree in Luke's Gospel, you'll see it's very different. All of the Gospels are written from a different perspective. They have different interests, different emphases. They're trying to teach and help different groups of Christians. So in Luke's version of the family tree, he goes back a little further. He doesn't just go to David or to Abraham. He goes back as far as Adam. And he says Jesus ultimately was a descendant of Adam. Have a look at that diagram. Now remember this because I'm going to come back to this diagram a few times in the next few sessions. But here it shows in a diagrammatic form how all the ideals, all the hopes of those people in the Old Testament focus down onto Jesus. That they were called to exercise power and to be servants, but they blew it. Jesus comes and shows how it should be done. Luke's Gospel, on the other hand, is showing Jesus not just as a good descendant of Abraham, but because he goes back to Adam, he's saying Jesus is a good human being. I want to look at some of the characteristics of Jesus as they relate to the ripples we thought about the other day. Now, I'm going to ask you to do some work on this. And what I want you to do is think, what do you know from your knowledge of the Bible about Jesus in his relationship with God, Jesus in his relationship with himself, with other people, and with the environment? It would be very nice to have 2 or 3 answers for each of those circles. And you better tell me, first of all, which circle you're going to be speaking about. Okay, so I'm going to give an answer to do with Jesus' relationship with God, or whatever it may be. Who's first? Sarah?
With God, it was very much like a father. Not like the father that he really had control of speaking with him, and he was able to talk to him like we talk to our own dad. And it was very much like a father figure.
So God was a father to him, and there was communication between them. Okay. If someone has another answer on the God question, that would be fine too, but it doesn't have to be the next one. Heather.
Okay, he was God. So basically, they were one.
Okay, thank you. In a sense, Jesus is God, so they were very, very close. Remember, if that's confusing, how can the Father be God and Jesus be God? Remember the cartoonist. That is Bill Watterson the cartoonist, or is the little Bill Watterson in the cartoon, the cartoonist? Well, the answer is both of them are. So in theory, the character in the cartoon could phone home to the cartoonist to get instructions or whatever. So it's okay to say Jesus is God. They're very close. In a sense, we're saying they have one purpose, they think the same, they feel the same. There is one purpose that they have for our world. Thank you. Who's next?
In regards to his relationship with other people, Jesus treated people like others. In As the Deer, the song we sang this morning, it says, "You are my friend and you are my brother, even though you are a king." So it's saying that he treats people like equals, and he also loves them unconditionally, like a brother would, even though he is above them, but he placed himself at the same level or below people. So
Jesus treats people in some ways as equals. In others, he says, "I'm your Lord and teacher, and that's right." Would it be, I don't want to put words in your mouth. Maybe I do want to put words in your mouth. Would it be fair to say that he treats them with dignity? Would that be okay? Yeah. Treats with dignity. And what was the second thing you said, Trevor? You said something else.
I said that he loves them like a brother would, okay, or a father would even.
Right. And you said he loves them unconditionally. Yeah. Right. Helpful. Thank you. Loves unconditionally. Couldn't you have chosen a shorter word? Thank you. Now you can add to the ones we've already got, or you can add in different circles. It's up to you.
With Jesus' relationship with himself, he was very self-secure because he was able to know what was going to happen to him, and still he was able to get in people's faces about certain things.
Yes, secure. We could say confident. And as Sean says, part of the effect of being fairly sure of who he was how he could relate to other people. Trevor gave us some ways in which Jesus treated people positively. But some of his arguments with the religious leaders, for instance, were pretty much in your face. You guys are wrong. You are out to lunch. That's difficult to do. If you've ever had to confront someone you disagree with, it is not easy. But for Jesus, it came out of his security and confidence with who he was. And you know where that came from? It came from the center circle, his relationship with God as his Father, the unity that they had together. Something else. Who's next? Okay, Jeff.
I think he had a lot of respect for the environment and the natural world around him. It says often that Jesus went into the wilderness to spend time with God, meditating and praying, and it just shows that he had a great appreciation for God's creation, and he loved it.
Okay. So Jesus spent a lot of time in the wilderness. He found that was a good place to meet with God. That's one answer to that one. Who else wants to answer? John.
Just commenting on the environment, Jesus had full control of the environment. He controlled the wind, the seas, the air. He also made food go a lot farther than food could, and several times he fed many thousand people with very little, and that was just incredible.
Okay, good examples that he didn't just enjoy being in the wilderness, but he had power over the environment and made use of it. And interesting to see how he made use of it. All of these, stilling the storm, stilling the sea, making food, all of those were to serve other people. Interesting. Does that have any echoes for you? Someone with power and authority using the natural world to serve others. Aha. Any other answers that you have? Yeah.
Okay, I'd just like to point out that he created the environment, so that's sort of a good point to add in there.
Thank you. Yes. Especially in John's Gospel, Jesus is seen as the agent of the whole creation. Good. Anything that's important to add in any of these circles that you think, oh, I wish someone had said that? Yes.
Just to add to the environment one, he had an extremely unique relationship with the environment. Like when he walked on the water, he not only did he control the whole storms, but he walked on the water, and I think that's pretty incredible.
Yes, it's a pretty unique relationship with the environment. Thank you. Walking on water. That's pretty good, pretty thorough. And remember in the session about what's wrong in our world, we saw how once our relationship with God begins to go wrong, all the other relationships begin to fall apart as well. They don't totally fall apart. You don't have to be a follower of Jesus to have a strong marriage or to be happy in your family or to do your job well. But there is a tendency, once we're out of touch with God, for those things to fall apart. Through the Old Testament, God was trying to get people to get their act together. Once they gave their loyalty back to God, the other things would work out. Didn't happen by the end of the Old Testament. But when you come to Jesus, you see someone who seems to have it all together. That his relationship with God is close and intimate and strong. He spends time with God, but all the time he is in touch with God. That then has a spin-off in how Jesus feels towards himself. We would say he's a very together person. I suppose the opposite of being together is that you're very scattered, right? Your thoughts and your feelings go off in different directions. But Jesus is very focused in who he is because of that. One interesting thing is that he's not proud, but he's not falsely humble either. How about this for a definition of humility? Humility is the realistic appreciation of yourself. Can I say it again? Well, I'm going to say it again anyway. Humility is the realistic appreciation of yourself. It's very difficult for us because we are sinful to get that right and not go too far on the pride side and not too far on the false humility side. But Jesus had a good sense of who he was. He talked about his relationship with others, how he showed care to the outcast, to those who were oppressed in that society, whether it was the poor or women or people from different nations. You could even say Jesus was the first feminist because of the radical way that he treated women with dignity. But another aspect of this is that the religious people accused Jesus of going to too many parties. Did you know that? In Luke chapter 15, there are 3 parables. There's the story of the lost sheep, story of a lost coin, and story of a lost boy. In all of those, Jesus is saying the world has got away from God. The world is like a lost sheep, a lost coin, a lost boy. And in each story, Jesus' job is to bring people back. But you look at those stories sometime, each one ends the same way. Do you know how it ends? Not with the sheep coming home, not just with the coin being found, not just with the boy coming home, but with a party. 3 times in that same chapter, Jesus says, the sheep was found, and the shepherd called his friends together and had a party. The woman found her coin. What did she do? You guessed. Called in the neighbors, had a party. The son comes home. What does the father do? Calls in all friends and relations. My son's come home. We have to have a party. So Jesus was criticized for going to too many parties, but he was making a point. He's saying naturally in sinful society, people tend to move away from each other. They can't agree. They can't get on. They're too proud. They won't serve, whatever it may be. In fact, in C.S. Lewis's book, The Great Divorce, he describes hell as a grey city, which is always expanding. Do you know why it's always expanding? Because people are always moving away from each other. We can't get on with these neighbors. They're really terrible. It's not our fault, of course. We just need to move to the next subdivision. And Jesus reverses that process, begins to draw people together, to make them family, community, to enjoy one another, to celebrate God's kingdom, to have parties together. But his relationship with God also, as you spelled out, means that he does some different things from us as human beings. Uses God's world to serve in a pretty unique way. Okay, another question for you to think about. In some ways, this is the most important question of all of these sessions. The question is very simple. 3 words. Was Jesus normal? Was Jesus normal?
Well, it depends on how you look at the word normal. If you go by society's definition of normal, Jesus was very odd because he didn't go with the flow or give in to temptation. But if you look at God's definition of normal, he was very normal because he was perfect and he did exactly what he was supposed to do.
Thank you. I don't think I have anything else to say. Jenna said there are 2 definitions of normal. One is, as she put it, the way that society is, and the other one is the way that, how did you put it, the way God wants things to be? Mary Helen, do you want to add something?
You can't nobody in this room can really say whether or not Jesus is normal, because everybody here has a different definition of normal. Because what is normal, really? It's just what is relative to you. Like, your definition of normal is going to be different than mine.
Right. So when we stay there, when we think about the question of what is normal, what kind of answers could there be?
Like, for some people, normal is just not mentally ill. But for other people, normal is maybe the way you live.
Right. And even our definition of what is mentally ill changes from one society to another.
Exactly.
Thank you. That's why what Jen said is so helpful, because she said there is one definition of normal that will change according to the society that you're in. Where could we get another definition of normal that's not simply what society says? Jen suggested what God thinks about what is normal. Heather, did you want to add something?
I think that Jesus was normal physically, like in his body and stuff, but I don't think he was normal because he was extraordinary, and he doesn't want us to be normal. He wants us to be like him, which is extraordinary and wonderful.
Thank you. It's like that line from Dead Poets Society, live extraordinary lives. So there are 2 definitions. Here's one way to focus it. Is it normal for people to get divorced? For married people to get divorced? Is that normal? Well, 2 ways of looking at it. If you look at it from a society point of view, oh yeah, it's very normal. I know lots of people whose parents are divorced. It's not unusual. It's not extraordinary. But the other way to look at it is to say, is that the way that marriage is meant to be? Oh no. Most people who get divorced don't want to get divorced. They know it's not what they intended when they started off. It's not normal according to the idea of marriage. It may be normal according to the reality. So when you look at Jesus, in many ways he's extraordinary. He's unique. He's not normal. People don't go around walking on water. But in another sense, maybe he is normal. Because the way that we've diagrammed it here, we've seen that's how God intended for human beings to be when God created them. In another sense, then, it is Jesus who is normal and we who are abnormal. Jesus shows us how God always intended for people to be. Yes, he's different, but he's also the standard that God holds up before us. You may want to think, and we're not going to discuss it now, whether if we were perfect like Jesus, we also could walk on water and do the things that he did. My hunch is yes, but I wouldn't die for it. So what is your image of Jesus? When you hear the name Jesus and a picture comes into your mind, what picture is it? Many of the pictures that we have, whether it's from Sunday school or the media, are frankly very, very unhelpful. Here's one, for instance, from Maclean's magazine a few years ago, an issue called Who Was Jesus? And there is a picture of your Lord and Saviour on the cover. Now, I ask you, is this a person that you are going to follow to the ends of the earth? Is this a person that the religious leaders are going to criticize because he goes to too many parties? I don't think so. Is this a person the children are going to crowd around because they want to sit on his knee?
Oh, yeah.
Here's another one. This is maybe my favorite. Would you follow this Jesus? He's very sweet. But he certainly, never hiccuped. Certainly never went to the bathroom. I can't imagine Newfoundland fishermen following someone like this. In fact, I'm afraid for this picture they got a fashion model and stuck on a beard and moustache. So it looks to me. It is wild. If Jesus is, in a sense, a normal human being, why do we make him look so weird? Let me offer to you a different image of Jesus that to me conveys this idea of God's normal standard. It's a clip from a movie called The Judas Project. And I like this because of the sense of overflowing life. You're just going to see a short bit. There's a bit of the Sermon on the Mount, and then there's the feeding of the 5,000. The second main character in this clip is Judas. At this point, Judas is very much on Jesus' side, so don't be confused by that. Also, halfway through, there is someone already spying on Jesus and his followers, and you see him looking through the lens of a camera. And I think you're meant to think of the crosshairs of a rifle, that even now, Jesus is under threat of death. So let's watch it just to get the sense of a different image of Jesus. Jesus as fully alive, as someone you and I might actually be interested in.
What reward is in that? I am telling you to love your enemies and pray and forgive those who persecute you. Do you expect God to do for you what you're not willing to do for others? Since God is your Father, shouldn't you be a reflection of Him? Anything that lasts is built upon a solid foundation. My words give life. And anything built upon my words will last forever. But if you reject me, you're building on sand. When the winds, the floods come, whatever you build on will be undermined and fall to ruin.
Jesse, they're hungry and cold.
I like it.
Bring me the bread and cheese from the back of Jude's hand.
I think Pete's the wrong one to send for the food.
Jesse, it's only a couple loaves of bread and some cheese. It's not even enough to feed Pete, much less all these people.
Hi, sweetheart. Well, take it. Go on, take it.
Not me.
Only when you're willing to give what little you have will God use it, multiply it, and teach you the true meaning of prosperity.
Yesterday I met a man. I even joined the band of the traveling man. And people come from miles around to see the show. Wouldn't you know? I heard the people shout that he's the king, but he shakes his head and says he just wants to share a dream. He's just a man with a band and a magic show, a man with a dream everybody wants to know. But I'm the only one who thinks it's just a show. But there's something deep inside that says I wanna know. We took the show from town to town. I watched him heal the blind, change water to wine. You don't know what went through my head with just the sound of his voice. I saw him raise the dead. I heard the people shout that he's the king, but he shakes his head and says he just wants to share a dream. He's just a man with a band and a magic show, a man with a dream everybody wants to know. But I'm the only one who thinks it's just a show. But there's something deep inside that says I gotta know. And it was then he came to me, and with his eyes, oh, he looked right through me. Then he shared his dream with me. He said, if you believe, oh, you'll never be lonely. I heard the people shout that he's the king, but he shakes his head and says he just wants to share a dream. He's just a man with a band and a magic show, a man with a dream everybody wants.
Kind of a different image of Jesus in that movie. Not wimpy, not religious, but with a deep passion for God. And wherever he goes, people come together. They're hungry for what he's got to say, and they love being around him. Isn't that what you would expect when the creator of the world is written into our script and begins to hang around? That those who are needy think, oh, this is what I'm looking for. And wherever he goes, he draws people together People begin to enjoy one another's company. They begin to be honest in a way that maybe they haven't been before. And they party. I mean, that's a great party. Even Judas just laughing his head off. He's so happy to be around Jesus. In a sense, Jesus is the third normal human being ever. Adam and Eve were normal before the trouble started, but nobody else was normal from that day until Jesus came along. And that's partly why Jesus says, anyone who's seen me has seen the Father. Say, what's the connection? Well, people were created in God's image. You remember the mirror? When people were created, it's as though God could look at human beings and see his own face reflected back. When we went wrong, that mirror was cracked and crazed. Yeah, there's something of God's image still in us, but it's not clear. But when Jesus comes into the world, it's clear once again. People look at him and they say, aha, there's God. And so Jesus can say, anyone who's seen me has seen the Father. There is nothing to get in the way of us seeing God through this perfect human being. Remember this diagram? We talked about God's laws in the Old Testament trying to recover the full 3D image of God in a human being. Didn't happen. Until Jesus comes along and he can say to God, I always do those things that please my Father. Those laws of God are fully integrated with Jesus' human nature in an amazing way and a beautiful way. Some of the early Christian writers, as they think about Jesus, say things like, he was the image of the invisible God. He is the exact representation of God's being. Remember that triangle I showed you? And I said, bear that in mind. Luke's gospel is not just saying Jesus fulfilled everything that was going on in the Old Testament. Luke is saying it's more than that. It's more than that. Jesus fulfills everything that God had in mind for all of humankind. It all focuses down on this one human being. You can see now why I asked you at the beginning what your definition of being a Christian is. Let me close with a story. This is a story from another of the Narnia series, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. If you're not familiar with this story, you have to know that the children from our world have entered Narnia and are going on a sea voyage on the ship, the Dawn Treader. And one of them, Eustace, has really been a pain in the anatomy. They come to an island and they have to work to repair the ship, and Eustace doesn't want to work. He doesn't know about being a servant and being a leader, you know. So he goes off into the mountains, finds a dragon's cave and a dragon's treasure, and goes to sleep there. And when he wakes up, he finds that he is a dragon. He's had dragonish thoughts, and as you know, what you think on the inside at some point is going to work out on the outside. That happens to Eustace in a rather alarming way. But then something happens that changes him. He encounters Aslan the lion, who is like a parable figure of Jesus in our world. But listen to what happens to Eustace in this bit of the story, and it will help you with a fresh definition of what it means to be a Christian. Eustace has come back to his shipmates, he's become a boy again, and he's telling his story to his friend Edmund. He's a dragon. He's remembering when he was a dragon. This is how he tells the story. I looked up and I saw the very last thing I expected, a huge lion coming slowly towards me. And one strange thing was that there was no moon last night, but there was moonlight where the lion was. So it came nearer and nearer. I was terribly afraid of it. You may think that, being a dragon, I could have knocked any lion out easily enough, but it wasn't that kind of fear. I wasn't afraid of it eating me. I was just afraid of it, if you can understand. Well, it came close up to me and looked straight into my eyes, and I shut my eyes tight, but that wasn't any good, because it told me to follow it. You mean it spoke? I don't know. Now you mention it, I don't think it did, but it told me all the same, and I knew I'd have to do what it told me, so I got up and followed it. And it led me a long way into the mountains, and there was always this moonlight over and around the lion wherever we went. So at last we came to the top of a mountain I'd never seen before, and on the top of this mountain there was a garden, trees and fruit and everything. And in the middle of it there was a well. I knew it was a well because you could see the water bubbling up from the bottom of it, but it was a lot bigger than most wells, like a very big round bath with marble steps going down into it. The water was as clear as anything, and I thought if I could get in there and bathe, it would ease the pain in my leg. But the lion told me I must undress first. Mind you, I don't know if he said any words out loud or not. I was just going to say that I couldn't undress because I had no clothes on, when I suddenly thought that dragons are snaky sorts of things, and snakes can cast their skins. Oh, of course, thought I, that's what the lion means. So I started scratching myself, and my scales began coming off all over the place. Then I scratched a little deeper, and instead of just scales coming off here and there, my whole skin started peeling off beautifully, like it does after an illness, or as if I was a banana. Well, he's English, he would have said banana, but I'm translating. In a minute or two, I just stepped out of it. I could see it lying there beside me, looking rather nasty. It was a most lovely feeling. So I started to go down into the well for my bathe. But just as I was going to put my feet into the water, I looked down and saw that they were all hard and rough and wrinkled and scaly, just as they'd been before. Oh, that's all right, said I. It only means I had another smaller suit on underneath the first one, and I'll have to get out of it too. So I scratched and tore again, and this underskin peeled off beautifully, and out I stepped and left it lying beside the other one, and went down to the well for my bathe. Exactly the same thing happened again. And I thought to myself, oh dear, however many skins have I got to take off? For I was longing to bathe my leg. So I scratched away for the third time and got off a third skin, just like the two others, and stepped out of it. But as soon as I looked at myself, I knew it had been no good. Then the lion said, but I don't know if it spoke, "You will have to let me undress you." I was afraid of his claws, I can tell you, but I was pretty nearly desperate now, so I just lay flat down on my back to let him do it. The very first tear he made was so deep that I thought it had gone right into my heart. And when he began pulling the skin off, it hurt worse than anything I've ever felt. The only thing that made me able to bear it was just the pleasure of feeling the stuff peel off. You know, if you've ever picked the scab off a sore place. It hurts like billy-o, but it is such fun to see it coming away. I know exactly what you mean, said Edmund. Well, he peeled the beastly stuff right off, just as I thought I'd done it myself the other 3 times, only they hadn't hurt. And there it was lying on the grass, only ever so much thicker and darker and more knobbly looking than the others had been. And there was I as smooth and soft as a peeled switch, and smaller than I had been. Then he caught hold of me. I didn't like that much, for I was very tender underneath now that I had no skin on, and threw me into the water. Smarted like anything, but only for a moment. After that it became perfectly delicious, and as soon as I'd started swimming and splashing, I found that all the pain had gone from my arm, and then I saw why. I turned into a boy again. You'd think me simply phony if I told you how I felt about my own arms. I know they've no muscle and they're not great compared with Caspian's, but I was so glad to see them. And after a bit, the lion took me out and dressed me. Dressed you? With his paws? Well, I don't exactly remember that bit, but he did somehow or other, in new clothes, the same I've got on now, as a matter of fact. And then suddenly I was back here, which is what makes me think it must have been a dream. No, it wasn't a dream, said Edmund. Why not? Well, there are the clothes for one thing, and you've been, well, undragoned for another. What do you think it was then? Asked Eustace. I think you've seen Aslan, said Edmund. And I'm going to leave with you for today the question of what that story says about what it really means to be a Christian. And we'll come back to that story tomorrow. Before we close, I'm going to pray. Lord Jesus, thank you for your beautiful normality. You are just a wonderful human being. And as we look at you, we see what God is like, and we appreciate it very much. Some of us, Lord, I think feel a little bit like Eustace with a dragon skin on, and we try to change it ourselves. Help us to submit to you and your claws, knowing that really you want to do what is good for us and remove that dragonishness from us. May we be patient. May we allow you to do it, even though it's going to be painful. And we look forward to being the people that you're going to make us when we get rid of that dragon skin. So help us through this day to hear you, to follow you, to obey you, and to love you. We pray in your name. Amen. Building Blocks is a series of 8 sessions about Christian faith.
I think it gives us a strong foundation to work with.
It conveys the idea that aspects of Christian truth build on one another to make a whole that is interesting, practical, truthful, beautiful, intriguing.
I like the Building Blocks because he puts lots of parables into it so that you can understand.
It clears up many questions about Christianity and about what we believe. And
my hope is that the young people who go through the Building Blocks program will come out with a deeper, broader, higher understanding of their faith than they've ever had before. You might think it's a little strange to go to church on a Thursday, but this is like a new church and a new religion, and they knew that Christians met on Sundays, and Jews met on Saturdays, and Muslims met on Fridays, so Thursday was kind of a free day for a new religion, right? So I went along. I wasn't sure, what to expect, but I'm kind of into spirituality. If there's a religion that I like, that makes me feel comfortable, well, I might just join it. So I went to check it out because it really turned on my friend. Well, within about 5 minutes of getting there, I wasn't sure about this place. See, for instance, at the front of the church building, there was a table kind of a thing, and on it, you wouldn't believe what was on it, but there was a model of a wooden gallows. You know those things that they used to hang people on? I thought, that is really a little weird. Anyway, I thought, okay, everyone to his taste, and we'll see what happens next. But then I noticed, as the people began coming in, that some of them had a little model of a gallows hanging around their neck. Some were made of wood, and some were gold, and some were silver. And some were just the gallows. Some actually had the body of a man hanging from it. Ugh, I'm not sure how I feel about this. And this gallows thing, this hanging thing, was obviously very central to their religion. In fact, they gave me this noose as a souvenir, which I thought was I think it was nice of them. Maybe it was a hint or something, I don't know. And from time to time during the service, and I never knew when this was coming, they would sort of make the sign of the gallows across themselves. And you should listen to the songs that they were singing. It's very, very bizarre, and I actually found it quite offensive. I actually had a friend whose father hanged himself, committed suicide that way. If she had been there, she would just have freaked out. There were songs like, when I survey the wondrous gallows on which the Prince of Glory died. I thought, do I need this? I said to my friend, what is going on here? And he said, oh, well, it was our leader. He was hanged about 100 years ago, but we still worship him. I thought, that's nice. And soon after that, I made an excuse just to slip out. I said I needed to go to the washroom, but I didn't go back. I thought, who needs that kind of stuff in a religion? I want a religion that will kind of make me feel comfortable, you know, where I can find peace and serenity, and I can get away from all that yucky stuff out there in the world. I mean, I've seen those movies, Dead Man Walking and The Chamber about capital punishment. I don't need that when I go to church. That's really horrendous. So I don't think I'll be going again. It's not what I need. At the heart of Christianity is something very like a gallows, except it's a cross. But the cross 2,000 years ago fulfilled much the same function as the gallows or the electric chair or the guillotine in our society. It was a means of capital punishment. It's just that for many of us, it's kind of a long time ago. We see a cross and it's a nice kind of thing, but we don't really think that it is actually an instrument of torture and an instrument for executing the very worst kind of criminal. It's actually true that a friend of mine freaked out the first time she saw me wearing that noose, although it was just a visual aid, for the very reason that I told you. But today, we don't associate it with death and torture and people we know. In the time of Jesus and shortly after that, if you had known that the Christians used a cross as the central symbol in their religion, you too would have freaked out. Because Jesus wasn't the only person who was crucified in those days. There were thousands of people that the Romans crucified. And when you saw that, you might freak out because quite possibly a friend or a member of your family might have been killed by crucifixion. You think, oh, I don't want anything to do with that religion. That is just so disgusting. But we don't have that sense of its reality. So for us, the cross is often just a piece of jewelry that we wear without really thinking about it. I heard of one woman who went into a jewelry store to buy a cross, and the man there said, yes, madam, we have lots to choose from. Would you like one with a little man or without? And for him, it was just a matter of, do you want it with a little man or without the little man? Had no other meaning than that. For us, the cross is often just a piece of jewelry, but when it was invented, it was something very different. I suspect that Christianity is the only religion in history that has as its central symbol an instrument of torture, something which was for executing the worst kind of criminal. It's either totally crazy or it is very deep. I vote for deep. In one sense, Jesus dying in the way that he did was the most important thing that he ever did. If you look at his biographies, the 4 biographies we have in the Bible, you'll find that about 1/3 of them are devoted to the events surrounding his death. That's how important the writers thought that event was. You compare it with any other biography, maybe 300 pages long, you don't expect 100 pages to be about the person's death, maybe 10, because that's kind of an unfortunate end to the person's life, but it's not as important as the things they did during their life. And then when you think about the way that Jesus died, that's a little weird too. In fact, it's very weird. Someone like Buddha died very serenely and calmly. Socrates, the great philosopher, died calmly and with dignity, surrounded by his friends who were weeping, and he was calming them and reassuring them it's okay. Wow, wonderful way to die, if you get to choose. But when you look at the death of Jesus, of equal historical significance, Jesus died in agony, tortured in body and spirit. His friends had abandoned him, and he was crying out, "Why?" to God. That's a little bit different. Let's look at a movie version of the death of Jesus. This is the film version of C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Let me remind you, the lion Aslan is the Christ figure. Aslan is the Turkish word for lion. And here you will see him surrendering himself to the powers of evil in the world of Narnia. And you will see him die. And I don't know about you, but for me, it helps to bring home the awfulness of what really happened to Jesus.
Stop. And whatever happens, do not let yourselves be seen, for your lives will be in danger. Remember, do not let yourselves be seen.
Who has won? Fool! Did you think by all this you would save the human creature? As agreed in our pact, I will kill you instead of him. And so the deep magic from the dawn of time will be appeased. But when you are dead, what is to stop me from killing him too? You have given me Narnia forever. You have lost your own life, and you have not saved his. In that knowledge, Aslan, despair and
time as well. Mean things. They just tied them so tight out of sheer spite. We'll never get them undone. We must. Keep trying. No use. Oh! Mice! Horrid little mice crawling all over him. Go away, you little beast. Wait. Do you see what they're doing? Why, they're nibbling at the cords. They must be friendly mice. Poor little things. They don't realise that Aslan is dead.
What on earth was going on in the death of Jesus? The first Christians, as they reflected on it, came to one conclusion more strongly than any other. And Paul expressed it this way, that God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself. Now remember where the story has come from. The problems in our world began because we separated ourselves from God. I suppose the proper word would be alienated ourselves, turned away, became disobedient, all those things we thought about. So naturally, if things are to be put right, first of all, that relationship has to be put right. Therefore, at the heart of things, the Christians said, in the death of Jesus, in some mysterious way, God was reconciling us to himself, putting the relationship back together so that everything else could begin to be mended. I say it's a very mysterious thing. There are many ways to understand how that reconciling took place. Let me tell you about some of them. One way that Christians over the centuries have thought about what Jesus did on the cross is to say Jesus was a mediator. If two groups are arguing with one another, your teachers and the school board, for instance, sometimes a mediator is brought in who can go from one to the other and try and get them together, help one to understand the other and bring peace. And one idea the Christians had was, it's as though Jesus is reaching out with one hand to God and the other hand to us and saying, I want to get you together and bring us together like that. So a mediator, that's one picture of what Jesus is doing. The second one is to say Jesus was a substitute. And I put there a verse from the Old Testament. Isaiah there says, all of us like sheep have gone astray, we have all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Now, I find it helpful to picture some of these things. So suppose that God is up there, and this hand represents us, humankind. When we are created, we were created to have a relationship with God that we would be open and free and wonderful. But when we turned our back on God, it's as though a barrier came between us. Just as with you and a friend, or you and your parents, you disobey, you get out of step, you argue over something, and there's a barrier between you. And in the case of us and God, it means that God's light no longer shines on us. We've turned away from the light. And that's what Isaiah is saying when he says, all of us like sheep have gone astray, we've all turned to our own way. We've done our own thing instead of following the Good Shepherd. But when Jesus comes into the world, he doesn't seem to have that problem. If this is Jesus, he has that open, full, free, wonderful relationship with the Father which human beings had once upon a time. But there's no barrier in his case. And yet, when Jesus dies on the cross, he cries out probably the most awful words in the history of the world. My God, why have you left me alone? Why have you abandoned me? Well, it's a good question. Why would God abandon a human being like that? Why is the relationship broken for the first time in eternity? And Isaiah says, we, like sheep, have gone astray. We have turned each one to his own way. And the Lord, Yahweh, God, the personal name, has laid on him, on Jesus, the wrongdoing of us all. That's why Jesus was cut off from God. Not because of anything he had done wrong, but because of what we had done wrong. He was a substitute, taking that barrier in our place. So what happens to us? Now it's possible for us to come back into that full, open, free, wonderful relationship with God. That's another picture. None of these is a full picture. Like any picture, it's 2 dimensions. Even if you put them all together, you don't get the full picture, but you get some of it. Here's a third picture, and Jesus uses this himself. He says, the Son of Man has not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many, a ransom. Now, we know how ransoms work. Someone is in prison, someone is kidnapped, you raise a lot of money, you hand over the money, and the person is set free, right? In the stories of Jesus, there is one character who comes up in all 4 Gospels. It's a person who's only mentioned once. He doesn't show up again, but he seems to be very important for some reason. His name is Barabbas. Now, maybe you remember the story of Barabbas. He was in prison at the time that Jesus was arrested. He was a murderer. He was due to be executed on the same day as Jesus, and there was a cross prepared for him with his name on it, probably. That's Barabbas' cross. He's murdered. He is going to be killed. That will be justice. That's what he deserves. And he probably knew that. But then, if you remember the story, on that morning of Good Friday, Pilate, the Judean governor, the Roman governor of Judea, stands before the people and says, I'll release for you either Barabbas or Jesus. And the people say, we'd like you to release Barabbas. He's a good guy. Well, what about Jesus? Oh, you can crucify him. That's okay. We don't need him. Crucify him. And in my imagination, I see Barabbas leaving the city with his friends. He's just so delighted. He thought he was going to die, and now he's alive. And he can go off and do whatever he wants. Fight the Romans again if he feels like it. But as he's leaving the city, he sees a man carrying a cross to a place of execution. And he stops for a minute. And he thinks, wow, that's what I was supposed to be doing this morning. Do you know who that guy is carrying that cross? Oh yeah, that's Jesus from Nazareth. Well, what did he do wrong? Oh, he never did anything wrong. Oh, why is he dying? Well, you won't believe this, Barabbas, but he's dying on the cross that had your name on it. But now he's taking it. You did wrong, but you're going free. He did nothing, and he's dying. Jesus was a ransom for Barabbas. And my guess is that that's the reason he's there in the story, because all of those writers thought, we can learn something from Barabbas, that Jesus died as a ransom for each one of us. But I want to include the last example, a picture of what Jesus did for us. You probably know the story of the 2 lost sons, the one who ran away from home and the one who stayed at home but was still lost. There's something very strange about that story. Many people see that as the heart of Jesus' teaching, the story of the runaway boy who comes back and is accepted back. But if that's the heart of Jesus' teaching, why is there no crucifixion there? Why is there no cross in that story? Isn't that pretty important? Think of it like this. If a friend really, really hurts your feelings, you have 2 options. Either you can hurt them back. There'd be justice in that. You'd feel good about that, in a way. You could do that. Or you could say, I'm just going to take that hurt, I'm going to accept it, and I'm going to go on loving that friend as if they had never done it. And that hurts. That's called forgiveness, right? And forgiveness is a difficult and a painful thing. So when the son runs away from home and stays away from home, it gives the father great pain. Of course. And when the son comes back, the father has that same choice that you and I have. Either to say, you dirty, rotten scoundrel, you have hurt me so much. Why don't you get back in the pigsty? Yeah, you can be my servant for a couple of years, and then we'll talk about whether you can come back in the house. Nobody would have complained. The neighbors would have said, that's a good way to treat that kid. He needed a little discipline. That father's acting as fathers ought to behave. Father could have done that. Bounced the pain off himself back onto the boy. But the father takes the other course. He says, I'm going to take that pain. I'm not going to bounce it back on the kid. I'm just going to welcome him home and take him in, and we're going to have a party. So the father chooses to keep the pain inside himself. Wow. Now, in Jesus' teaching, that's a picture of God. You can think of it this way, that everything we have done wrong in this world causes pain to God. Every war, every refugee camp, every concentration camp hurts God. But not just on the big scale, for us too. Every greed, jealousy, gossip, hatred, the list could go on. All of those things that you and I do more often than we like to admit, those hurt God as well. And God too has that choice, either to say, you guys have messed up so bad, I'm going to punish you, you're going to feel everything that I've felt. That's what you deserve. We couldn't complain. That would be justice, right? But the God that Jesus taught about is a God who says, I'll take that pain. I'm not going to bounce it back on you. It stops with me. I'm going to go on loving you as if you had never done it. But the pain of all of that hurt that we have done to God and God's world kills God. And it killed God on a Friday afternoon in the Middle East. You know what I'm saying? So where is the cross in the story of the lost son? Is there a cross? There is a cross. The cross is in the heart of the Father. And in a sense, that's what we see when Jesus dies on the cross. We see the pain in the heart of the Father and how much God is willing to take for us because he loves us so much. We need to move on. Jesus died on a Friday. On Sunday morning, people began to say, something has happened around here, and we're not quite sure what it is. People began to see him alive. First of all, the women said, we've seen him, and the men said, yeah, likely story. Then the men started seeing him, and then they believed it. Some things don't change. They didn't always recognize him. Sometimes they did. He was very normal, in some sense. He would eat with them. They could hug him. They could touch the wounds in his hands if they wanted to. But in other ways, he was totally different. They could be in a room that was locked and barred, and suddenly Jesus was there in his body. How did he get here? We don't know. There he was. And he would disappear just as quickly. It sounds an unlikely story, but there were so many witnesses that it was very convincing. For instance, Paul talks about one occasion when there were 500 witnesses of Jesus alive from the dead. 500. I know an Anglican clergyman in England who one Easter Sunday, the day that Christians remember Jesus coming back to life, went into the pulpit to preach his sermon, and before he started to preach, he took out of the flower arrangement a daffodil. And slowly and methodically, he ate the daffodil. Then he began his sermon, and he said, if you went out of this church this morning and said to a passerby, you'll never believe what happened in our service this morning, the Reverend John Collins ate a daffodil in the pulpit. Yeah, right, what is this, April 1st? Give me a break. But what if two people went out of the church and said, he's right, it's true, I know it sounds weird, but actually he did eat a daffodil. Say, did you cook this up between you? What are they putting in that communion wine these days? Or, whatever. But then he said, supposing that 500 people come out of the church and they all say the same thing, you going to believe them? He said, probably you will, just because the evidence is so overwhelming. And then he made his point that more than 500 people saw Jesus alive and well after the crucifixion. That is strong evidence. But what's happening in this idea that Jesus came back to life? What it says in the Narnia stories is that death begins to work backwards. let's watch the bits so that we have our happy ending, and then I'll say some things about it. This is a shorter clip.
They've gone. Shouldn't we be getting back to camp? If there's going to be trouble. We can't just leave him lying there. Oh, my legs are almost giving way. I feel so tired. Well, we have been up all night. Cape Paravel. Do you suppose we'll ever reach it? They're doing something worse to him! Come on! What's happened? They might have left his body alone. But who has done it? What is it? More magic.
Yes, more magic.
Aslan! Oh, Aslan! You're not dead, Aslan! You're not a...
Do I look like it?
Oh, you're real! You're real! Aslan! Aslan!
Oh, I feel my strength coming back to me. I feel it is time for a roar. You'd better put your fingers in your ears.
Aslan, could we ask you, how did it happen? We saw you on a stone table, tied, and we saw you.
The witch knows the deep magic, but there is a magic deeper still which she has never known, for her knowledge goes back only to the dawn of time. In the stillness and the dark before time ever began, there was a different incantation. When a willing victim who has committed no treachery offers his life in a traitor's stead, the stone table will crack, and death itself will be denied.
Oh, I see. We cried our heads off, and you knew all along it would be all right.
I knew of the old incantation, but it has never been put to the test until now.
You took that risk to save Edmund.
Come. We've a long journey to do. You must ride on me.
There are two ways to think about the resurrection. One is to stand at the door of the tomb and look in and see that Jesus has gone. The other way is to turn around and look out from the door of the empty tomb and to see what you see. And what you see is very interesting. Here are some of the things that it means that Jesus rose from the dead. One is, it suggests that God approved of what Jesus had done in his life. Jesus didn't raise himself from the dead. Dead people don't do that. Only God can do that. It's as though God was saying, well done, good and faithful servant. I approve of what you've done and what you have said. That's one thing that happens. The second thing is to say death is defeated. You remember when death came into the world because of cutting ourselves off from God, and God is, after all, the source of life. So when we cut ourselves off, death comes in. Now that enemy has been defeated in a final way. Death is still in our world, but for those who are followers of Jesus, it's a very different thing. It also means, as we look from the resurrection, that Jesus' promise to return at the end of time seems much more reasonable. You see, during his lifetime, Jesus promised two impossible things. He said, I'm going to die, and I'm going to be raised again, and then at the end of the world, I will come back and judge everybody. You think, yeah, right, okay, nice. Because both those things are impossible. People don't rise from the dead. It's very unlikely that anyone's going to come back at the end of the world who's been dead for 2,000 years. Why should we believe that? But now, out of those two impossible things, Jesus has done the first one. He said he'd rise from the dead. People doubted it, but then he did it. So when he says, I will return at the end of time and I will be the judge of all the world, wow, we better take that seriously. We'll come back to that thought in another session, but hold that thought for the time being, because it's very important. And the last thing that you see as you look out from the empty tomb is the realization that Jesus is no longer dead in that tomb. Jesus is at large, hanging out in our world, meeting people. Not in a physical form anymore. If Jesus had only lived those 33 years in one place, millions of people would never have met him. But one thing that is possible because of the resurrection is that Jesus is available to touch people's lives today. So what, we say? Well, one so what is this, that the things that Jesus did and said in the Bible 2,000 years ago are no longer locked up in an old box called the Bible. Because Jesus has broken out of the pages of the Bible and is around today, the sort of things that Jesus said then also speak to us today. I want to give you an example of this. Here is one of my favorite sayings of Jesus. It comes from Matthew's Gospel. Let me read it. Jesus said, "Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." The first Christians didn't call themselves Christians. In the Bible, the word Christian only comes, I think, 3 times. It wasn't very important to them. The thing that they called themselves most of all, most frequently, was actually disciples. And a disciple means a learner. They were learners. They were students. Who were they students of? Well, they were students of Jesus, of course. For them, the heart of the Christian faith was to be a learner from Jesus. If you want to call us Christians, that's up to you. But that's not what's important to us. What's important to us is that we learn from Jesus. Well, what is it that you learn from Jesus? When you're thinking about university, you'll look for a school that teaches what you want to learn. Or you might be interested in a particular school, but you want to know, well, what's it good for? What do they offer there? And so if Jesus is running a school, you want to know, well, what is this school good for? For me, the theme of the school of Jesus is summed up in his saying, "I have come that people might have life and have it in all its fullness." What you get in the school of Jesus is learning about life. In the 1940s, a writer in England called Dorothy Sayers wrote a series of plays for radio called The Man Born to be King. They were based on the life of Jesus, and they're based on what really happened, but she also adds some of her imaginative reflections on the story. And she puts in the mouth of Mary Magdalene, one of the earliest disciples, students, this wonderful speech about what made her become a student of Jesus. Mary was a person who thought she knew what life was all about. Now listen, this is what she says to Jesus. "Jesus, did you know? My companions and I came there that day to mock you. We thought you would be sour and grim, hating all beauty and treating life as an enemy." Well, he was religious after all, right? "But when I saw you, I was amazed. You were the only person there that was really alive. The rest of us were going about half dead, making the gestures of life, pretending to be real people. But the life was not with us, but with you, intense and shining, like the strong sun when it rises and turns the flames of our candles to pale smoke. And I wept and was ashamed, seeing myself such a thing of trash and tawdry. But when you spoke to me, I felt the flame of the sun in my heart. I came alive for the first time, and I love life all the more since I have learnt its meaning. I think that is just so beautiful. That here is a person who thinks she knows how to have a good time. She knows what life is all about, but when she meets Jesus, she realizes that the life she's experienced is like a candle. What Jesus has is like the rising sun in the morning. She thinks, wow, I never knew. And she becomes a follower of Jesus because she wants to learn about life. And where better to learn it than from Jesus, who invented it in the first place. But what is it that we learn in the school of Jesus where we learn about life? How does it work? As we learn from Jesus, he teaches us all sorts of neat stuff. Jesus teaches us about God. Jesus teaches us about ourselves. Jesus teaches us how to live in God's world as God's people with God's friendship. Jesus teaches us what our part is in God's story, the story that God has been writing since the beginning and will write up to the end. Well, how do you fit in? Only Jesus can teach you. Jesus also teaches us about suffering and death. A few years ago, my wife Debbie was in hospital and nearly died. And when she came out, she reflected on that experience and she said, you know, everybody suffers in this life. You don't have a choice about that. Whether you're a Christian or not, suffering comes your way. God allows it. You don't have a choice about that, but what you do have a choice about is whether you're going to suffer by yourself or you're going to suffer in the hands of a loving God who has himself been hurt and still has the scars to prove it. I thought that was pretty neat. We will suffer. Where better to suffer than in the school of Jesus, where Jesus can teach us about it. How does the school work? In the middle of this saying of Jesus, he uses an interesting picture. He says, "Take my yoke upon you." This is the yoke, the wooden bar that you would put across the back of an ox and then you would drive it pulling the plough. For years I thought, I'm the ox, Jesus puts the yoke on me, and then he's the farmer and he walks behind and I pull the plough. Soon after we came to Canada, we went to Black Creek Village in the north end of Toronto, where everything is as life used to be 100 years ago. And there I saw something I'd never seen before that completely changed my understanding of the saying of Jesus. I saw a cart being drawn by 2 oxen with one yoke going over the 2 backs. I thought, wow, that makes so much sense. It's not that Jesus is lining me up to be the ox and I will do the work and he'll walk behind, but rather he's saying, I'm pulling the plough already and I would like you to come and share the yoke with me. Apparently in those days, often what you would do is yoke together an older ox and a younger ox so that the younger could learn from the older. That's how Jesus teaches about life. That he doesn't do it in a classroom, but in a sense he says, I'm already out there in the world. I'm interested in what's going on. I'm interested in bringing people into relationship with God. I'm working for their wholeness and their healing. Now you come and work alongside me and I'll teach you what I know. Wow. And you think of the first disciples, the first students of Jesus, the 12. How did they learn from Jesus? Well, they hung out with him every day, 24 hours a day. They walked together, worked together, slept out under the stars together, ate together. They shared life. They saw Jesus at work, and he gave them assignments. Okay, you've seen me do this preaching and healing, now you go and do it. And they learned about life from Jesus. Jesus says a funny thing in this saying, however. He says at the end, my yoke is easy. Now, if you have been a follower of Jesus for more than about 5 days, That will sound a little weird, because it's not easy to be a Christian. Say, Jesus, what did you mean by this? I am told that the Greek word for easy is better translated well-fitting. Think of going to buy a pair of shoes. You try on lots of pairs of shoes. Some are too big, some are too small, some pinch at the side, some pinch at the toe. And eventually you find a pair of shoes that fit perfectly and you say, wow, that is a really easy fit. That makes more sense, doesn't it? That the yoke Jesus lays on it is one that fits us. Doesn't mean it will be easy, doesn't mean it'll be a cinch, there'll be hard work, but it's yours. It will be an easy fit in that sense. Apparently in those days, yokes would be made for each individual ox. They didn't just mass produce them and churn them off the production line. But you would go to the carpenter's shop with your ox, and the carpenter would shape the yoke to fit the back of your ox and no other. In Christian tradition, Jesus was a carpenter. We don't know if that's historically true, but it's kind of a nice idea. And it's certainly true that Jesus is saying, I will shape the yoke for your back. Come and submit yourself to it and walk with me and work with me. I like that idea. On the day that Jesus made this speech for the very first time, what do you think happened? He made the speech, came to an end. Most people, I imagine, began to drift off. Wow, that's really interesting. Hear that stuff about the yoke? Oh yeah, a couple of oxen mine. I understand what he's saying. But as the crowd was moving away, my hunch is that a few from here and there went against the crowd and came up to Jesus. And maybe with a little embarrassment said, Jesus, you know that stuff that you were saying about being your student and taking your yoke? Do you think I could do that? And whoever it was, Jesus would say, wow, that's great. I'm so glad that you asked. Of course, you're welcome. We're just going to have lunch. Why don't you come with us and meet the others? And people would have joined the school of Jesus on that day because he said, come to me. I thought, okay, he says, come to me, I better come. Now, because Jesus rose from the dead, he's still going around saying to people, come to me, come to me, come to me. Come and be my student. Come and learn about life from me. Come and take my yoke upon you. Well, how do you do that? Jesus isn't around to go and say, excuse me, Jesus, could I do this? No, that's true. But Jesus is here by his Spirit. And we can talk to Jesus just as simply and directly as if he was here in physical form. That's what the resurrection means. Let me give you an idea of the sort of thing that people say to Jesus when they want to join his school. People will say something like this. Jesus, I want to learn from you how to be fully alive, how to become the person you created me to be. Okay? So there's a willingness to say to Jesus, I think this is what I need. I think this is right for me. I apologize for not committing myself to being your student before now. Please forgive me. Because all of us have followed other teachers, right? We've looked at other influences, media and friends, to learn about life. But other people don't really know about life in the way that Jesus does. Right now, I want to accept your invitation to share your yoke and to give myself to you as my teacher. Help me to be a faithful student of yours from this day on. Because this is a school that goes on for a long time. You may not graduate for many years. So you want God's help to be faithful in the school. Before we finish this session, I would like to pray this prayer again. And I'm going to pray it this time more slowly, and I'm going to pray it phrase by phrase, and I'm going to leave a silence after each phrase so that you can echo each one silently in your heart to Jesus if you would like to do that. It's an amazing invitation that Jesus issues. Why wouldn't anybody take him up on it? You don't need to close your eyes. You may want to keep looking at the prayer. But as I said, if you know that this is what you need and you need to do it now, then you echo this prayer phrase by phrase silently to Jesus. Jesus, I want to learn from you how to be fully alive, how to become the person you created me to be. I apologize for not committing myself to being your student before now. Please forgive me. Right now, I want to accept your invitation to share your yoke and to give myself to you as my teacher. Help me to be a faithful student of yours from this day on. If you said that to Jesus, would you tell someone about it today? Because the sooner you can get on with the classes and get into the textbook and join the other students, the easier you'll find it to be a student in the school of Jesus. It's as though in the story that God is writing about the world, Jesus is the casting director. I sometimes think they should give Oscars for people who do casting directing. And it's as though when someone comes to Jesus and says, Jesus, I would love to have a part in God's story. I'm tired of trying to write my own story. It's not working. That Jesus says, that's great. Let's talk and we'll figure out what the part you have to play in God's story is to be. And we'll pick up the story in the next session when we think about how it works in practice to live as a student of Jesus and to have our story woven in with God's story. Let's pray. Thanks, Lord Jesus, for your death and resurrection for us. Help us never to forget how important it is. Help us not to trivialize it, as happens in our society. And thank you especially that you're alive today and that you offer yourself to us as our teacher. Help us to respond to your teaching, to learn the lessons you're trying to teach us, and to follow you faithfully for the rest of our lives. Amen.
That was